The pipe burst on a Wednesday morning in January at 6:43, which Nadia Ashford knew because she looked at her phone when the sound came through the ceiling of her ground-floor office at Ashford Capital Management on the third floor of 114 Calloway Street. And the sound was the kind of sound that makes a person look at their phone to record the time, because the time is the first useful fact in what is clearly about to become a sequence of useful facts that someone will eventually need. The building had 8 floors. Nadia owned the 4th floor, which was a commercial condominium unit she had purchased 9 years ago when Ashford Capital was 2 people and a filing system, and which was now the home of 11 people and a filing system that had outgrown 3 iterations of itself and was currently in its 4th. The offices below and above were occupied by other businesses. The floors below the commercial units were residential. The building had a homeowners association and a property manager named Glenn, who Nadia had called, and who had not answered, and a maintenance line that she had also called, that had connected her to an answering service that told her someone would be in touch within 4 business hours, which was not a useful answer to a pipe bursting at 6:43 in the morning. Water was coming through her ceiling near the northwest corner, which was where the server room was. And the server room was where the servers were. The servers were where 8 years of client records and transaction histories and compliance documentation lived. What? And the backup drives were in the server room too, because the IT firm that had set up the system had placed them there, and Nadia had not yet implemented the off-site backup solution that she had been meaning to implement for approximately 3 years. She was doing 3 things at once when the man arrived, moving the servers with her office manager, Raphael, who had come in at 6 because he always came in at 6, calling the plumber who had done work in the building before and who was actually answering his phone and attempting to reach the property manager by a third method, which was showing up at his voicemail with such frequency that he would eventually be unable to ignore it out of self-preservation. She was not panicking. She was operating in the register she occupied when things were going wrong and required correction, which was fast and specific, and not particularly warm. The man appeared in the doorway of her office at 7:14. Somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a canvas work jacket over a grey sweater and carrying a cup of coffee in one hand and looking at the northwest corner of her ceiling with the expression of someone who already knows what they are looking at. She had made an assessment of him in the first few seconds that she would not have articulated if asked, because it happened below the level of articulation, in the category of reading that experienced people do automatically in a crisis, sorting the people in the room into the ones who are going to be useful and the ones who are going to be managed. She had placed him in the managed category, not from hostility, but from the rapid processing of available information, which was that he was here without credentials or introduction, wearing work clothes, in her office at 7 in the morning when her office was not typically occupied by people she had not invited. She had filed him under neighbor who has come to look, which is a category of person who means well and tends to generate conversations she does not have time for when the servers are at risk. He said, "The Marchetti unit above you." The connection between the baseboard, heating, and the main supply line. It's been a slow leak for a while and today it failed. Nadia stopped what she was doing and looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm sorry, I'm Jerome. I live on the 6th floor," she said. "How do you know it's the Marchetti unit?" He said, "Because I was in the building when it happened, and I know the heating system. Has Glenn come?" She said, "Glenn has not come." He said, "All right. Do you want help with those?" He was looking at the server rack that she and Raphael had moved to the center of the room. She said, "With the servers." He said, "Getting them to somewhere dry. And you'll want towels along that northwest wall now, before more comes through." "Do you have towels in the building?" she said. "This is a financial services firm. We don't typically stock towels." He said, "I'll get some." He said it the way people say things when they have already decided to do them and are informing you as a courtesy. He came back 11 minutes later with 4 large towels and a bucket, and he helped Raphael position them along the northwest wall while Nadia was on the phone with the plumber, who was on his way. And at no point did he offer an opinion about how things were going or provide reassurance of a type that would not be useful. Because he appeared to understand that what was useful was the towels and the bucket and the 2 hands. At 8:15 the plumber arrived, and the ceiling had stopped dripping, but the carpet near the northwest wall was saturated, and the smell of wet building material had begun. At 8:30 Nadia's operations director, a woman named Priya, who had been with the firm for 6 years, and whose primary attribute in a crisis was that she moved toward the crisis rather than away from it, arrived and assessed the situation in under a minute, and began doing the next correct thing without being told what it was. Jerome had been sitting in the chair near the door out of the way with his coffee, which was somehow still warm. When Priya arrived and the situation had stabilized to the degree that it was going to stabilize in the immediate term, Nadia looked across the room at him. She said, "Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know your last name," he said. "Whitfield." "Jerome Whitfield," she said. "Mr. Whitfield. Thank you for the towels," he said. "Of course. I'm sorry about your ceiling. And your carpet," she said. "It's Glenn's carpet, or the building's carpet. I'm honestly not sure." He said, "I can look into that for you if it would help." She said, "You can look into whose carpet it is." He said, "I can look into the building's responsibility for the water intrusion, given that the failure originated in a common system." She looked at him. He said it in a way that suggested he was not guessing. She said, "Are you in real estate law?" He said, "Not exactly." She said, "What does not exactly mean?" He said, "It means I'm more on the ownership side." She said, "The ownership side of what?" He said, "This building, among others." She said nothing for a moment. She was doing something she did not often do, which was holding 2 pictures in the same frame simultaneously and noticing the distance between them. The first picture was the one she had assembled at 7:14 when he had appeared in her doorway, a neighbor, a person of no particular consequence to the situation, someone to be thanked and moved past. The second picture was the one that existed. In fact, the owner of the building she had occupied for 9 years, who had appeared in her office not to inform her of his ownership or to manage her expectations or to begin a conversation about liability, but to carry towels. She had placed him in the wrong category in under 4 seconds. She was good at reading people, which she knew, because the business she had built required it. And she had built it successfully, and she had placed him in the wrong category in under 4 seconds. This was information she was processing carefully, and with the honesty she brought to errors in her own work, which was to say without excusing them. He said, "I should have said that at the beginning. I'm sorry. It seemed like the wrong moment when you were moving the servers." She said, "It was the wrong moment when I was moving the servers." He said, "I know." She asked if she could show him the damage to the northwest corner. He said he had already seen it. She said, "Of course you had. If you are watching this from a city where the person who showed up to help turned out to be the person who mattered most in the room, drop it in the comments right now. Subscribe and ring the bell, because this one is about what a man does when someone needs help, and he is in a position to give it, and about what the ceiling of a flooded office reveals when you look at it correctly. Stay with me. Jerome Whitfield had grown up in Gary, Indiana, in a house his parents had rented for 14 years before purchasing. With the combination of discipline and accumulated time that turns a rental into an asset if you stay long enough and are careful enough about what you do with every dollar between the beginning and the end. His father, Delbert, had worked for 31 years as a facilities supervisor for the Gary School District, a job that required him to understand every building the district owned. Not in the theoretical way of an architect, but in the practical way of a man responsible for what happened when the heat failed, or the roof leaked, or the boiler made a sound that meant it was about to fail rather than that it had already failed. Delbert Whitfield was a man who knew buildings from the inside, from the pipes and the electrical panels, and the load-bearing walls and the drainage systems, and the specific ways that specific categories of building failed when they were not attended to correctly. And he had transmitted this knowledge to Jerome, not through formal instruction, but through the habit of taking Jerome with him on weekend calls when a school needed attention that couldn't wait until Monday. Jerome had grown up understanding that buildings were not static objects but living systems, that they required continuous attention the way a living thing requires continuous attention, and that the attention was not optional if the system was to keep functioning. He had also grown up understanding something about the relationship between attention and authority that Delbert had demonstrated without naming it, which was that the person who pays attention to a building owns it in the only sense that matters, regardless of what the deed says. A building whose owner does not pay attention will be managed by whoever fills the vacuum of that attention, which might be a good facilities person or might be deferred maintenance, and the slow accumulation of what deferred maintenance becomes when it is left long enough. Delbert had shown Jerome a school roof once on a Sunday call, had a leak that had been reported for 2 years and patched twice, and was now failing in a way that had progressed from a nuisance to a structural concern because the water had been finding the wood framing for long enough to begin its work. Delbert had stood on the roof in February and shown Jerome where the water entered and where it traveled and how far the damage had progressed, and he had said this was a $20 repair 18 months ago. He had said it without drama, as a fact about how time and attention work when they are applied incorrectly, and Jerome had carried this fact with him through every property decision he had subsequently made, which was that the thing on the deferred maintenance list is not deferred. It is accumulating. The cost of the repair is increasing every day that the repair does not happen, and the question is only whether you are going to address it at the $20 moment or the $20,000 moment. He had also grown up understanding, in the way that children who watch their parents work come to understand things, that the person who actually keeps a building running is not the person whose name is on the ownership documents, but the person who is there on a Sunday in February when the boiler makes the wrong sound and who knows what to do about it, before it becomes the kind of wrong that requires evacuating a school. He had studied real estate development at Indiana University, a program that suited him because it combined the technical understanding of buildings with the financial understanding of what buildings are worth and why, which is not always the same thing, and the gap between them is where most of the important decisions in real estate actually live. He had been a focused student who worked part-time at a property management company in Bloomington, because he understood from his father that there was information available only in the doing of the work and not in the studying of the work, and the property management job gave him access to the doing. He had taken his first job after graduation at a commercial real estate firm in Chicago, where he spent 4 years learning the acquisition side of the business, the process by which value is identified and capital is organized and a transaction is structured and closed, and then left to work at a smaller firm that was doing development work in secondary markets, cities that were not yet drawing institutional capital, but where the fundamentals of population growth and employment concentration were strong enough that a careful and patient investor who arrived early could assemble assets at prices that the arriving institutional capital would later ratify. He had done this for 11 years, in 3 different cities beginning in Indianapolis, and then in Louisville, and then in a smaller market in the Carolinas that had been dismissed by institutional investors, for reasons that were not incorrect but were not the whole picture, and each time he had read the conditions ahead of the market and moved accordingly. And each time the market had arrived and confirmed the reading. The confirmation was never instant and was never clean, because markets do not move on timelines that are convenient for the people who have positioned ahead of them. There were years in the Indianapolis work and years in the Louisville work where the position was correct and the validation was not yet visible, and the investors who had backed him were receiving information that required them to trust the thesis rather than the current yield, and the trust had been extended because the thesis had been explained clearly and because Jerome had never presented a situation as simpler than it was. He had a practice which he had developed from something his father had said once about a school that everyone believed was fine and that Delbert knew was not fine, of making the maintenance visible rather than concealing it, of telling the people who needed to know what was actually wrong before it failed rather than after. Because the failure is always more expensive than the repair. And the person who told you about the repair before it failed is the person you call the next time. This practice had cost him 2 investors in the Louisville work who had preferred a picture of the asset that was more flattering than accurate. He had not adjusted the picture to retain them. The investors who replaced them had come specifically because of the reputation for accuracy, and they had been better partners for it. By the time he was 40, he had assembled a portfolio that was valued on the conservative end of the range of estimates applied to it at approximately $900 million, and that he managed through an entity called Whitfield Property Holdings that employed 61 people and owned or controlled assets in 7 markets. He lived on the 6th floor of 114 Callaway Street because he had owned the building for 7 years, and because the 6th floor had the best light, and because living in his own buildings was something he had done since his first acquisition. On the grounds that a person who lives in a building understands it in a way that a person who does not live in it cannot fully understand, and understanding was the foundation of everything else. He was a single father to a daughter named Imani, who was 9 years old and who attended the school 4 blocks from 114 Callaway Street, and who walked there every morning with the independence that Imani had negotiated at 8 and that Jerome had reviewed carefully before granting. Because independence granted before the preparation for it is complete is not a gift, but a risk, and the preparation had needed to be complete. Imani was a child of specific habits and specific opinions who had inherited from her father a quality of attention that her teachers described as unusual in a 9-year-old, and that Jerome recognized as the same thing his father had demonstrated on weekend calls in Gary, Indiana. The quality of someone who is fully present to the situation in front of them rather than to their own thoughts about the situation. Imani's mother, Dana, had been in Jerome's life for 6 years, and Imani's for all of hers, and had left them both 3 years ago for a set of reasons that were her own and that Jerome had listened to completely and had understood to be genuine even where they were painful. And he had not argued with them because they were not arguable from the outside. She was in Imani's life in the way that was available to her, which changed in form from season to season, and which Imani had found her own way of holding, with the particular resilience of a child who has a present and attentive father and has determined that this is sufficient for the work of growing up, which it is. Jerome had arranged his working life around Imani's daily schedule with the same precision he brought to a development project, which was to say with a clear understanding of the requirements and the constraints and a structure that honored both without sacrificing either. He worked early and late. He was home between 5 and 7, and the hours between 5 and 7 were not available for anything except Imani, which meant dinner and homework and the conversation that 9-year-olds have with adults, when the adults are fully present and the 9-year-old has determined that the adult is worth talking to, which is a determination Imani made about her father every evening, and that Jerome received without taking it for granted. He did not treat the arrangement as a sacrifice. He treated it as a constraint that had made the work better, the way constraints often make things better by forcing a more efficient use of the available time. The mornings were for the technical work, the site visits and the financial reviews, and the calls with the investors and the contractors and the property managers who worked in the 7 markets Whitfield Property Holdings operated in. The evenings were for Imani and for the reading he did after she was asleep, which was wide and without a particular agenda, because Jerome had formed the view early that knowing where the world was going required reading across categories rather than within them. and that the most useful thing he had learned about any market had usually arrived from outside the field of real estate. Imani knew the buildings her father owned in the same way she knew the streets of the neighborhood, as specific places with specific characters that she had formed opinions about through observation. She had opinions about 114 Callaway Street's lobby, which she found under-supported by natural light, and about the elevator, which she considered adequately maintained for its age, and about the boiler room in the basement, which she had been shown by her father on a Sunday when she had asked what made the heat come on, and he had explained it fully rather than approximately, because approximate explanations of physical systems were something Jerome did not offer to people he believed were capable of receiving the accurate version. And Imani was capable of receiving most accurate versions. He had been in 114 Callaway Street at 6:43 on the Wednesday morning in January because he had come down early to look at a noise the boiler room had been making, which he had heard through the building the previous evening, and which he had identified, based on the character of the sound and the time of year and the particular way the heating system in 114 Callaway was configured, as a pressure imbalance in the distribution loop that would resolve itself, or would present as a failure in one of the zone connections, and he had wanted to look at it before the building came fully alive for the day. He had been in the boiler room when the pipe in the Marchetti unit above Nadia Ashford's office failed, and the sound reached him through the structure of the building. And he had known what the sound was and had gone up to help. He had not announced himself as the building owner in Nadia's office at 7:14 because the servers needed to move and the towels needed to be acquired and the plumber needed to be on his way, and there was nothing about the announcement that would have accelerated any of those things. Nadia Ashford had built Ashford Capital Management without a particular plan for what it would become, which was unusual among people who build things to that scale, and she knew it was unusual. And she was honest about it when people asked. What she had had was a specific and reliable analytical instinct about which companies were undervalued and why, an instinct she had developed across 7 years at 2 different investment banks and that she had eventually decided could be better deployed for her own account than for someone else's. She had started with her own savings and 2 clients who were friends who believed in the instinct before it had a long enough track record to be defensible on its own merit. 8 years later, the assets under management were $2.3 billion. The track record was defensible on any basis anyone had ever applied to it. The firm was the thing it was because the instinct had been right more often than it had been wrong, and had been wrong when it was wrong. In ways that were manageable because the risk architecture she had built around the instinct was honest about its own limitations. She was not a person who thought much about what she did not control, which was both a virtue and an occasional liability, and she knew it was both, and had made a conscious decision to accept the liability because the virtue was load-bearing in the architecture of the business she had built. A person who thinks too much about what she cannot control cannot manage the things she can, and the things she could manage were numerous and consequential, and required everything she had. She thought about what she could control, and she attended to those things with complete focus, and she made peace with the things she could not control by not thinking about them more than necessary. The pipe had arrived in the not thinking about it category, which is why there was no off-site backup and why Glenn had been on her contact list without having been called since the previous April, and why the northwest corner of the server room had been a risk she had not assessed as a risk because it had not called itself to her attention. She was not a sentimental person, but she was a fair one, and fairness required her to acknowledge when a situation had been materially improved by someone who had not been obligated to improve it. She found him at 10:30 in the hallway outside her office, leaning against the wall with his phone, looking at something she could not see. She said, "I'd like to understand the building's liability for the water damage." He said, "You'll have a claim. The failure originated in the common heating system. The unit above you has a connection that has been on the deferred maintenance list for 2 years." She said, "How do you know it's been on the deferred maintenance list?" He said because I put it on the list and because the previous property manager did not address it. And then Glenn came and Glenn also did not address it. She said, and you know this, because you own the building. He said, yes. She said, does Glenn know that you know that? He said, Glenn knows I own the building. Glenn and I have had several conversations about the deferred maintenance list. She said, and yet the pipe. He said, and yet the pipe. She looked at him. She said, I want to ask you something. He said, please. She said, when you came in here at 7:14 with the towels, was that you as a neighbor or you as the owner? He thought about this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. He said it was me as the person who was in the building when the pipe failed and knew how to help. The ownership was secondary. She said, that's a good answer. He said, it's also an honest one. She said, those are not always the same thing. He said, no, they're not. Glenn eventually arrived at 11:40, which was nearly 5 hours after the pipe burst, and his arrival was not improved by the fact that Jerome Whitfield was standing in Nadia Ashford's office when he came in. Glenn had the expression of a man who has arrived expecting to manage a tenant and found instead that he is being assessed by the owner of the building, and the transition from the first posture to the second was not smooth and was witnessed by Nadia and Priya and Raphael, all of whom had opinions about Glenn that the morning's events had not improved. Jerome said little to Glenn in the office. He said, I'll talk to you in the boiler room later today. He said it without warmth or coldness, the way you say something when you have decided what needs to happen, and do not require the other person's participation in the decision beyond their showing up at the appointed time. Glenn left. The three people who had witnessed this exchange did not comment on it, but the quality of the silence they maintained for the following 30 seconds communicated a shared assessment that did not require expression. Nadia had the plumber's report and the initial damage estimate by noon. The damage to her office, the carpet, the ceiling panels, and the northwest corner of the server room was assessed at $38,000. She submitted this to the building's property management entity formally by email at 12:17. She received a response at 1:52, not from Glenn but from Jerome directly. The email was 4 sentences long. It acknowledged the claim. It confirmed the building's liability for the damage originating in the common system. It noted that a remediation crew would be there the following morning at 8 and that all costs would be covered. The last sentence said, for what it's worth, the deferred maintenance list is being addressed this week. The pipe that failed today was the one I should have insisted on first. She read this email twice. She appreciated the 4 sentences. She appreciated more the last one. She had been in business long enough to know the difference between an apology that is designed to manage a relationship and an apology that is designed to be accurate, and the last sentence of Jerome Whitfield's email was the second kind. It named a specific failure of judgment. It attributed the failure to the correct person. It not contextualize the failure into something more comfortable or distribute the responsibility across a set of circumstances that made the personal accountability less visible. He had known the pipe was a risk. He had not insisted on its repair. The flooding of her office was, in part, the consequence of that choice, and he had said so in plain language to the person who had suffered the consequence. She had written harder things to clients in letters about positions that had not performed as projected, and she had written them the same way, without the softening that comes from wanting to be forgiven rather than wanting to be honest. And she had found that the letters written that way produced better outcomes than the letters written because the person receiving them understood they were getting the truth, and the truth was the thing they could actually use. She filed the email and went back to work and did not think about it again until much later, when it had become part of the texture of the year rather than a specific event in it. She saw him in the lobby 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, collecting his daughter from the after-school program that apparently used the lobby for pickup on cold days. She had seen him once in the intervening 2 weeks briefly in the elevator, and they had exchanged the kind of greeting that people exchange when they have had a significant interaction and have not yet established what the ordinary version of the relationship looks like, which was cordial and slightly compressed. A full greeting in the space usually available for a partial one. His daughter was looking at Nadia with the thorough attention, the kind that children exercise when they have not yet learned to perform disinterest, which is a performance that most adults have acquired, and that most adults would be better off without. The daughter was 9, and had her father's height forecast in the length of her, and she was wearing a coat that was slightly too big, in a way that suggested it had been purchased for the growing into, rather than the present fitting. Jerome said, "This is Imani." Imani said, "Are you the one whose ceiling broke?" Nadia said, "I am the one whose ceiling broke." Imani said, "My dad fixed it." Jerome said, "The remediation crew fixed it." Imani considered this distinction and appeared to file it without fully accepting it, in the manner of a child who is willing to acknowledge a factual correction, without abandoning the underlying characterization that she considers accurate on the merit. She had heard about the burst pipe from her father, and had asked about it with the specificity she brought to things that happened in the building, because the building was the environment she lived in, and Imani had a proprietary relationship with her own environment. She said, "Did you lose any important things when it flooded?" Nadia said, "We moved the servers in time. Nothing important was lost." Imani said, "Servers are the ones that have all the information." Nadia said, "Yes, exactly." Imani said, "You should get a backup that's not in the same room." Nadia said, "You're right. We're working on that." Imani looked at her father and then back at Nadia with the expression of someone who is preparing a second question but is assessing whether the first one has been sufficiently resolved. Jerome put his hand on her shoulder and said, "We're going up." He looked at Nadia and said, "I'm glad the office is recovered." She said, "Thank you for the towels." And for the email, he said, "The email was easy. The towels were more useful." She said, "The email was also useful." He said, "Then I'm glad for both." He and Imani went toward the elevator. Imani turned once in the lobby and looked at Nadia again with the thorough attention, the way a child looks at something she intends to remember, and then the elevator arrived, and they went up. Nadia implemented the off-site backup solution the following week. It had been on her list for 3 years, and it took 4 hours to implement, and she noted, without much sentimentality, that it had taken a burst pipe and a 9-year-old to move it from the list to the done column, and she made a note in the margin of the project management document that said, "Things on the list are not finished." And she looked at the list for a long time afterward. The building's deferred maintenance items were addressed in February, all 12 of them, which she knew because Jerome sent the completion report to all commercial unit holders, not just to the ones who had experienced failures. She read the report with the attention she brought to any document that told her something about how a system was being managed, and the report told her that the system was being managed carefully and with a completeness that the previous management had not achieved. She filed the report in the folder she kept for building-related documents and made a note in her calendar for 12 months out that said, "Check building maintenance status," which was something she had never done before because she had never had reason to believe the building maintenance was something worth checking on, and now she did. The office on the 4th floor of 114 Calloway Street was quiet on the Friday afternoon when she did this, the way it was always quiet late on Fridays. Priya and Raphael having gone, and the 2 junior analysts having gone, and the light coming in from the west at the angle that it came in on January afternoons. Low and long, and sitting on the repaired corner of the office, where the carpet was still slightly newer looking than the rest of the carpet, which was the only visible evidence that anything had happened, and it would not be visible for long. The server room was unchanged in appearance and considerably more secured in practice. The off-site backup running now on an automated schedule that Priya had verified twice and that Nadia had spot-checked herself. Because a backup that has not been checked is not a backup but a hope, and hopes are not auditable. She looked at the corner for a moment and then went back to work. Because the work was there, and the work was the reason the office existed and the office was recovered, and that was what needed to be, and she was a person who moved toward the next thing when the current thing was resolved. The next thing was on her desk. She went to it.